This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. Hello, everyone, and thank you again for tuning in to the podcast. I think I'm not alone in the world of having spent a lot of sleepless nights over the last few weeks of reading Twitter and watching the news and commiserating or feeling for the people of Ukraine as these terrible wars unfolding. What some of you might not know about me and my background is that I actually speak Russian, and my whole kind of career actually began as a Russian specialist. And so I've been kind of brushing off my Russian and like reading a lot of Russian Twitter as well, and trying to kind of make sense of what's going on and what's being felt on the ground in Russia as well as in Ukraine. And today's guest, we're really very pleased to have someone who's also kind of been spending, I think, all of their career on these issues. We're joined today by Mark McNamee of FrontierView, which is a macroeconomic and political risk advisory firm. He's the head of Europe and is a specialist on Russia and Ukraine, and is here today to help me and maybe all of us make a little bit of sense of what's going on, because this, of course, is impacting sovereign debt and the frameworks and just global coordination. So, Mark, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate. As a first step, maybe you can also just tell us about FrontierView.
Sure. So thank you very much for inviting me onto the podcast here and have this obviously very timely discussion. Well, first things first, I suppose. You're not alone in having sleepless nights. Crazy enough, I'm based in London, but I happen to literally be on vacation, on holiday. I was back home in Ohio. I was supposed to be off of work, and then unfortunately, I had to run my schedule by Mr. Putin. So the invasion actually occurred, and woke up at about 3:00 in the morning, and naturally just started working, and have been basically working effectively ever since, consistently for about the last month here. So yes, I understand when you say sleepless nights there, Joe. So as far as FrontierView and my role with the firm, so FrontierView is a global macroeconomic and political advisory firm. We serve almost exclusively multinational corporations at a global level. So we do focus more generally on emerging markets, but we do, of course, work in developed markets extensively as well. And basically, just the short 30-second version of what we do, we connect the macro to the micro, right? So we offer an analysis on the sort of the 30,000-foot view of events, what these political dynamics, these security issues, social issues, et cetera, have an impact on the overall business market, on macroeconomic dynamics, et cetera. And then sort of our differentiator is that we connect that 30,000-foot view with what it means for if you're a GM running the Russia business for a consumer goods firm or a B2B firm, an industrials firm, a healthcare firm, et cetera. Making those linkages from the 30,000-foot view down to what does it mean for them when they come into the office Monday morning, 9 a.m. They have meetings with their retailers, with their distributors, with their staff, et cetera. And so making those linkages to how this impacts their operating environments. And then giving executional advice, of course, related to distributor management and things of that nature. My specific role with the firm, as I'm director of Europe, so I'm responsible for all of our forecasts and products related to all of Western Europe, Central Europe, and Russia CIS. But my personal responsibility relates to Russia CIS markets. As you mentioned, this is my academic and professional background for about the last 15 to 20 years now. And more specifically, we've been holding for the last few years every quarter business events attended by usually up to about 50 general managers of Western multinationals. We run business benchmarking surveys on operational executional topics with responses roughly around 150 corporations responding to these surveys. And I was there most recently, actually, holding an event at the beginning of February. Departed Moscow just 10 days before the invasion, in fact. So had very, very interesting conversations at the time, what the expectations were on the ground from, of course, very seasoned, well-educated, experienced general managers of these multinational firms. And I can confirm that all of them were extraordinarily shocked at this move, as was the rest of the world and, well, in general, the investor environment. So just sort of a brief introduction.
No, thank you for that. So that I think that's really, really helpful for all of us, is to try to kind of understand, what is actually, as you say, kind of bringing this down to kind of, practical, like what does all of this mean, and where is this going to lead, and what are people's expectations, both kind of the actors involved as well as people that are just running businesses. So first I'd kind of like to just cover some of the basics. And I know that you're probably more in the weeds in all of this than I am, but kind of where are we exactly, and what is the current state of play? I mean, we've heard even just kind of over the last 24 hours that there's been kind of maybe a little bit of glimmer of hope of some sort of ceasefire talks, but at the same time, we're hearing that ceasefire just really actually means stop and reload. Like, so what is your reading of the current situation?
Yeah, sure. So that is where we're at, right? I wouldn't say a ceasefire. I would say that they're setting down very, very preliminary foundation for what could potentially come to be a ceasefire at some point in the future, which then ideally could evolve over time again into a more comprehensive peace deal. But we are far away, despite maybe reports that the Financial Times article that came out was excessively optimistic. In reality, we're still far away from moving even towards a ceasefire, to be perfectly frank, where each sides are at and their demands. So this should be most definitely interpreted as the Russian army in particular buying for time. It's been clear, and if you're following military analysts evaluating the situation, that they had certain objectives, which they assumed political objectives and military objectives, they thought they could achieve within literally a matter of days, within a week. That became abundantly obvious at the onset that was not going to be the case. And so then they sort of continued sort of along this sort of misguided strategy for another couple of weeks until where we are today, where now this should be interpreted as the Russian military is taking now its time to regroup, shore up its logistics, its supply chains, and then move to sort of the next phase of the war. Obviously checking in, right, in this time to see if Ukrainian position has moved at all, and maybe they could get a quick exit with a quick victory. That wasn't going to be the case. And very sort of disconcerting is that, yes, we have seen Moscow's objectives sort of moderate to an extent and unilaterally, but the aims remain still quite maximalist. And it seems very clear that as they're talking, there's still bombardments going on. We saw in Mariupol, we saw the theater shelled that was housing a lot of displaced people, up to 1,000 or so displaced people. So of course that doesn't build any trust at the negotiating table, naturally. So it's very clear that Putin's strategy remains to escalate on the battlefield in order to put the Russian side in a position of clear strength. And then, assuming he's sticking with his announced invasion plans and objectives, this would be essentially he will not, he's determined to win, and winning being dictating the terms really down Zelensky's throat and forcing capitulation. So as of today, that's what we can say pretty confidently where we're at. Of course, how things develop, it's war, it's very unpredictable. We'll see where things are in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But I would say, unfortunately, what's quite concerning here is that at each point over the last several months, even before the invasion, we have seen Putin escalate at every single turn effectively. And I think now we're moving to this next phase of the war, which unfortunately we've been, of course, cheering on. We've been looking at the Ukrainian resistance and the resilience, and it's admirable, it's glorious, etc. But at the end of the day, once the Russians utilize more of their air power and that air superiority that they have, we're likely moving into a much more brutal phase of this conflict, unfortunately.
Sadly, I agree with you, but I want to kind of maybe dig a little bit deeper on how do you think we got here, in the sense of, like, what are these Russian objectives? Is Putin just kind of just constantly escalating? He's been testing it out. He's been trying to kind of destabilize the West. He's been trying to kind of test NATO. He's been trying to kind of call our bluff in the sense of like, we're not really going to, defend each other. Is he trying to, is his objective, in your opinion, to show that the alliance is really just not willing to act? Is he trying to draw us in by targeting civilians? What do you think is his end game?
No, I don't think draw NATO in by targeting civilians. I think it's just to overwhelm Ukrainians to submit to Moscow effectively. So I don't think it's necessarily trying to draw in intentionally a conflict with NATO, though over time that it could evolve into that, maybe even inadvertently, of course, but maybe overtly that may become a possibility. We can talk about that later, but holding that aside for now, the objectives, I mean, as stated by the Kremlin and as well, frankly, as Putin has been quite direct about for about 15 years, is that he does not see Ukraine as a separate nation. He does not believe in Ukrainian nationalism. He thinks it's all effectively made up ever since 2014 in the Maidan, that this revolution was simply a Western-backed, CIA-inspired regime change. But in his belief, right, is that and democracy is totally artificial in the country. So all you have to do is remove the head of the snake, and then you can obviously reimpose power on their Slavic brothers, who will then be rejoicing and feel, liberated in the end. That's clearly the military sort of strategy upon going into the country too. That with how sort of forces were deployed, that seems to be in line with his vision of the nation as well. Obviously, massive miscalculation. So you kind of ask, how did we get here? We got here because Putin is really trying to protect his legacy. In the end, he doesn't want to go down in the history of Russian czars as that leader who lost Ukraine. And to audience members here who wouldn't maybe understand the psyche of the Russian mentality, and they see Kiev as sort of the heart, and correctly so, as sort of the heart and the root of, right. I mean, Kiev was on a map 500 years before Moscow existed, right? So this is really the heart of it. And so Putin, to protect his legacy, and he's been in power for over 20 years, he's approaching 70 years old. He only really deals over the last, really since 2014, Crimea and then the initial war in the Donbass, he's really only been dealing. He can't be bothered with the low-level things. He's only dealing with the big geopolitical topics, and there's nothing more core, right, than Ukraine.
I've been kind of thinking of it, and kind of going back to my old Russian history books and courses in university, is really thinking through. I mean, Kiev was the beginning of the Orthodox Church for Russia. I mean, that's where the first bishops were baptized, and that's where Orthodoxy kind of for Russia began. And so when Putin has kind of reestablished Russian greatness kind of post the fall of the Soviet Union, it was really based on a resurgence of the Orthodox Church and kind of this kind of, again, kind of harnessing that power of, kind of mythology, so to speak, of the Russian identity, was, kind of rebuilding the cathedrals, kind of connecting again with the church. And so in some ways, this kind of starts then to make more sense to me when I start kind of remembering all of that like Kiev is actually central to this kind of vision of Russia that he has been trying to kind of reconstitute. So, I mean, I look at it personally as not so much as a reconstitution of the Soviet Union, which I think even Putin would say was glorious on some aspects, but, not to be repeated. But he's trying to build something else. And it's not really Tsarist Russia either. It's something else. It's kind of this, kind of new concept.
Sure, right. And by the way, it's unclear what this new concept is, or if he really is harking back to maybe the Tsarist period, which I think is a better metaphor than, say, the Soviet.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Ukraine, right? Crimea specifically, right? This is where Orthodoxy came to Ukraine. So that's why it's so central. to the Kremlin's mindset here. And then I also think it touches on some other issues. Is what does he mean as far as sort of regathering, in his vision, right? Regathering these Slavic lands and reuniting Slavic brothers. So we've seen the absorption of Belarus the last couple of years, obviously with what's going on in Ukraine, and the feeling that he had lost maybe Ukraine, or was gradually losing Ukraine over the last 8 years. So he felt compelled. But then what does that mean for stretching beyond that? And that's one of the most common questions we get from clients. Is it just Ukraine? Where does he go beyond?
Yeah, exactly.
This?
Yeah, is it Moldova? Then what?
Is this Slavic land? So then you're going to Poland, clearly, right? Moldova, which isn't protected by NATO, so maybe that's just an easier one to pick off. It wouldn't be, by the way, but nonetheless. So what does he actually mean? The hope, as we're kind of describing it here, is that he's been reading all these history textbooks. He's in the last several years, while sort of isolated and alienated during COVID. We're hoping in the mind of Putin that what he means by sort of gathering the Slavic lands and reuniting the Slavic brothers, hopefully he just simply means Belarus and Ukraine for now, right? And then we'll see how far this goes. But in either case, then hopefully, at least in his vision, because it seems clear that he's made a decisive turn over the last month in terms of his cost-benefit analysis, and obviously we've read a lot about, is Putin a rational actor or not, and what vision of reality is he working in currently, et cetera, et cetera. This will become obviously important in terms of some of these next moves here, depending upon what his ultimate aims are, what he feels he needs to achieve to then have a victory to bring back home, return to the population, et cetera. So,
and from your readings, and in your work, do you get a sense that the Russian people are kind of behind him in this? I mean, it seems from my, like I say, my late night or middle of the night reading of Twitter, it seems to be very generationally split. Kind of older generations kind of just falling in line and saying, for Putin, whereas the younger ones are perhaps kind of more used to kind of a new a new vision of Russia. What are you thinking or seeing or hearing?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. So assuredly, yes, older generation, basically anybody over 50 has a sort of a natural inclination to sort of get in line.
Are you saying I'm in the older generation?
Yes. Okay, what I should say is those who remember the Soviet period well. Okay, so maybe not that old. Okay, I should just say that. Whereas younger people, basically, if you're born after about 1980 or so, right, you vaguely remember the 90s, somewhat, kind of, sort of, but your life has been Putin. Your life, the definitive periods of your life, the defining moments of your life occurred in a lot of cases in 2000 to 2010, which was quite nice in Russia. Since then, of course, it's taken a different turn. So it's very split by age, yes, but it's also split by, of course, education levels. Similar issues we see, in the Western world, educational levels, urban-rural divide, et cetera, beyond just simply the age demographic topic. So there's that. Then always looking at what type of percentages of people are actually supporting this. What does this mean? You look at polling for approval for Putin or disapproval over the last several years. What do these actually mean? Do they actually approve of him, or is this how you answer in an authoritarian regime to polling, or is this just you might as well ask these people, do you love Russia? They're going to just line up behind their leader and say, yes, I love Russia, hence I love my leader. So it's very hard to parse out. What I would say a little bit more definitively is that, well, a couple of things, but there is considerable support currently for this as it's been sold by the Russian media, which has done a very good job, internally at least, helping control the information war to an extent. That is going to dissipate over time. Particularly, this has been defined as a special operation, right? When does a special operation turn into an actual war? How long can you say this is a special operation if this goes on for 6 months? Also, they've had far more casualties than they anticipated. More news comes back, and for every casualty, there's typically in war 4 to 5 people who are injured and taken out of combat who come back from war. All these people come back and tell stories. They're going to paint a very different picture than what, of course, the propaganda has been feeding. There's a lot of dimensions to it. You're also going to add in all the financial and economic duress that's coming. And very clearly, I'm in touch with numerous Russians, in Russia. there's very little understanding of how severe this is about to get very soon for them. When you look at currency depreciation, high interest rates, levels of inflation, government measures that they may do in the financial sector that could impact people's savings, et cetera. So this is going to get, of course, very, very difficult in the market very soon. How does that impact?
Perfect segue into my next questions, which is around the sanctions of just, we know from a lot of other cases that sanctions are very easy to put on and extremely hard to take off. And I'm not saying that we're at a point now of thinking of taking these off. If anything, we're going to escalate sanctions in any way. But can we just kind of dig a little bit deeper on sanctions? And since you're speaking to the business leaders, kind of how are those playing out on the ground in Russia, and are they hitting, do they have the bite and effect that kind of are intended with these sanctions?
Yes, I mean, these are undoubtedly the harshest sanctions really imposed ever. I mean, they've outstripped what is done to Iran, and to an entity this large, right? I mean, you have to think Russia's central bank reserves themselves, which have been sanctioned, notably, the central bank reserves themselves are larger than the entire Iranian GDP. Okay, just for size and scope here, right? Are they having an effect? Yes, and actually the biggest effect, first of all, the most dramatic sanctions are those sanctions on the central bank. Yes, SWIFT sanctions, very impactful. Yes, sanctions on major state-owned banks, very impactful, of course. But it's those central bank sanctions that are the most damaging by far. That, of course, is forbidden the central bank from supporting the ruble. And so we're going to see, as we anticipate, I'll talk about the sanctions outlook in a second, but we're anticipating more sanctions coming. That means we're going to see and impacting major exports, which means we're going to see much further currency depreciation coming. But the biggest issue, talking to corporates every day here for the last month, isn't even actually, it's not the issues with the currency as much as it has to do with the inability to actually just simply get supplies into the country. There's a lot of self-sanctioning going on. There's plenty of trade that's still allowed, actually, but with, of course, the SWIFT and the banking transactions, and then all the regulatory and legal compliance issues of all the shipping firms, insurance firms that are insuring supplies coming into the market, et cetera. They don't know what to do. They've been paralyzed. It's massive amounts of trade going on.
Exactly. Like you say, compliance departments would just kind of, everyone just freezes anyone, even if you're not sanctioned specifically. Your bank will say, sorry, you can't do this, or your insurance company will say, no, you're not covered anymore.
Right. And then also we've seen a lot of self-sanctioning. I've heard from numerous companies that have some local manufacturing in Russia saying that they might have a European supplier of some ingredient or some component part, and quite literally that supplier says, we're not contributing, we're not exporting to Russia. Now, of course, they say, well, we'll pay you more. They say, okay, fine. So they find some, but there's self-sanctioning going on. I mean, this is coming down to identity, and that's beyond the reputational risk, right? What I'm talking about, but the reputational risk, as you mentioned correctly, the reputational risk is massive in the West, and that's one of the points talking to corporates every day. I talk to the teams in Moscow. They really don't quite understand how the Western world really interprets this and how they feel about the market. Reputationally, I mean, this is irreparable. I mean, what has happened from the Western world's point of view. So it's really quite dramatic. The biggest point, though, is that it's about to get extremely difficult because you have extremely high levels of inflation already. And this is not related to the ruble. This is related to just simply shortages because of supply chain issues. So I'm hearing consistently from clients, the biggest problem by far is supply chain, just getting product, getting ingredients, getting components, et cetera. That's going to worsen dramatically, particularly as distribution within the country and with the financial sanctions and everything, high interest rates, you're going to see distributors going out of business. That's going to have massive worsening impact, of course, on supply chain problems. So that's going to get worse. And then you're going to start feeling in a couple of weeks, right? You're running out of the inventories of goods purchased at the earlier at the earlier exchange rate.
Right.
Now you're going to be dealing with this extreme depreciation. So that's sort of first and foremost. Regarding the sanctions outlook, as you mentioned, under our assumptions, right, that these sort of ceasefire talks and moving maybe towards a more comprehensive peace deal is really quite far off. And we're likely seeing the Russian army sort of regrouping for this next phase, which will become even more brutal. The worry here is that we're going to see numerous cities like potentially Kiev, Kherson, Kharkiv, what we just saw in Mariupol, resembling what Russia has done historically. Aleppo in 2015, Grozny earlier during the Chechen wars, things like this. So
total destruction. That's what you
horrific,
mean.
horrific destruction, which frankly would just morally compel and just shame the West into even harsher sanctions. So what's basically left here are more sanctions on the financial sector. So, for example, the EU hasn't sanctioned Sberbank, so Sberbank be thrown there. But then more critically than actually putting sanctions on Russian oil and gas, or at least limits on that. Or they're coming up, I've heard some sort of informal talk about clever ways of putting a tax on Russian oil exports, right? Which then basically you would force that tax onto the Russian producers themselves because they still need to sell it at a market rate, in which case that would drastically reduce their revenues, which would actually be extremely effective because the Russian budget, about 35-40% of budget revenues in Russia come from oil and gas. Most of it's from oil, in fact. So they can be relatively resilient because they can, over time, sort of redirect supply over to Asia. So that's possible for them to sort of ameliorate the situation. But if you put that tax on, then they'd be absorbing that. They'd be selling it well below. They're already selling it well below market rates. They'd be selling it far below market rates. We're talking $40, $50 a barrel, maybe. And then Asia would, of course, be demanding that price, right? Well below. So that's one of the interesting proposals, among numerous other proposals, to address commodity exports. But then you're getting into the areas of how much self-harm are we going to inflict on Western markets, and how much is our culture really prepared to suffer and just self-sacrifice. And beyond the sanctions, right, the self-sanctioning, how this has become a cultural issue, an identity issue for the West. In some ways, it's woken us up for the first time in 30 years. We have, an identifiable Western sort of enemy.
Yeah, we've almost kind of forgotten how to do that. I mean, that muscle has gone completely lax, right?
Right. Exactly, and it woke us up in the course of a weekend here. So we'll of course see how we respond. But this is why the EU at the end of this month said they're going to put together a plan for permanently, right, structurally weaning themselves off of Russian gas. Ideally, by the end of this year, cutting gas imports from Russia by 2/3. That's probably not achievable, right, without extraordinary self-harm, but it's possible to do 40% perhaps, or 30-some%. And then you move into, say, a year from now, a year and a half from now, and you're down to maybe 10%. What that does to the Russian government budget, what that does to the currency, and you can't redirect gas. It's not like oil. It's not LNG, right? Piped gas is coming from Yamal Peninsula up north by the Arctic Circle. What do you do with that gas? If you want to build a pipeline to Asia, be my guest, but you're years away from doing that. And by the way, you're going to make these massive investments while you're under these extraordinary sanctions, right? While trying to do this import substitution policies across numerous other sectors. Where do you actually get the cash from? Particularly as we anticipate, Russia's going to default, actually, in the coming months.
So this might be a little bit out of your wheelhouse, but does that then speed up the kind of climate transition plans of Europe? Or do they just get it from somewhere else?
No, well, they're going to get it from somewhere else. And depending upon the severity of this, how quickly this happens, if this in fact goes through, where they actually do just cut off gas imports, it is feasible in terms of just actual raw numbers. If Europe actually reduces a little bit of its usage of gas, and then you look around the entire planet and you find ways, how can we possibly do this basically in 9 months and get through next winter in Europe? It would take a Herculean effort. But energy analysts that we've seen have kind of done the numbers. Something's possible, right? You'd have to have basically Qatar and Australia cancel their contracts with Asia, send that LNG to Europe, right? You'd have to have, obviously, numerous countries going back to coal, including China themselves. Germany going back to nuclear soon. Much more gas. We'd have to see finally in Wall Street investors and U.S. shale finally coming back and investing far more. So that's been quite delayed. They'd probably need a political push there. So you'd probably need, this is something on the equivalent of like a Berlin airlift in 2022 in global energy markets. But could they be compelled if you're watching Kiev every day being turned into Aleppo and all these other cities, and you have refugees? I mean, who knows how many millions more that you're adding in. I mean, the humanitarian disaster that we're going to be watching on the newsreel, would that be enough then to motivate us in the West? I mean, these are open questions. And by the way, this is Putin's gamble, is that the West doesn't have, right, the sort of the resilience, the strength of the Russian people to suffer, and we will never sacrifice.
Okay, but in that scenario, is there then a scenario where we say, okay, well, we can't do that, kind of, we're not going to suffer in that way, but do we then just give up Ukraine and just let them win, or do we go in and just obliterate, and join the fight somehow?
No, I don't think so. And if you look at historical analogies, I hate to phrase it as you did, but you might not be far off. Basically, do we give up Ukraine? It's happened in the past. We obviously 1948, we more or less gave up, right, East Berlin. We did the Berlin airlift, but we weren't going to go to war over it, right? Then staying with Berlin, 1961, the Berlin crisis, as Kennedy famously said, a wall is a whole hell of a lot better than a war. We weren't going to go to nuclear war over this. Maybe Soviet Union would have, right? Because at that point, and there's a lot of analogies here which are very relevant. I mean, at that point, Germany was the edge of the Soviet Union's defensive sphere of influence, right? Now it's Belarus and Ukraine. So, and this is why we heard nuclear saber rattling from Putin, just within a week after the invasion, because that is his ultimate trump card. That is the exclusive area where he actually has leverage, and he knows he would go to this place potentially, in a place that the West would never consider going. So in 1956 in Budapest, same thing. Were we going to get into a nuclear conflict over that? 1968 Prague. So now the border has shifted. That 1,500 miles east, and now it's over Ukraine. I don't know. I mean, how do we phrase this? Are we selling out Ukraine? The West isn't going to go into World War III, a major conventional war, which very likely lead to a nuclear exchange over Ukraine, unfortunately.
So you don't. I mean, there's some commentators that are saying we're already in World War III. We just haven't realized it yet.
I mean, sure. But World War III fought with conventional forces across Europe, which Russia quickly identifies that it cannot win, particularly when you add in American troops. So they wouldn't be able to win a conventional war against just the European troops. You add in the American troops and the firepower, while Russia is currently bogged down in a war that they're struggling with in Ukraine on top of it. And then you'd have to institute martial law within Russia. You'd have to do mass conscription. You'd have social riots. And you're doing this while you have all these sanctions and you're trying to fund this. Russia would quickly come to the conclusion that this is utterly unwinnable. They'd be staring in the face of the annihilation of the Russian state. Clearly, the end of the Putin regime in the Kremlin. Under those conditions, would they? Well, Putin even said this. He said, "Why would we want to live in a world if Russia's annihilated? Why would we live in a world? Why should humanity exist if we wouldn't live in a world where Russia's annihilated?" Basically implying that we would use nukes if we're on the edge of annihilation. I hate to sound too dramatic.
I was just gonna say, you're not cheering me up.
No, I know. Imagine reading this every day for work.
No, I know, and I'm glad it's you, not me, kind of thing. I don't want to be thinking through all these scenarios. I'm trying to make sense of it a little bit for myself and for our listeners, and then kind of maybe taking it back of just like, so what is going to be the impact on this on the global order? Like if we just, if what we're kind of outlining here is kind of true, that we're not going to go to war, like we can't go to war and to defend Ukraine, and we can maybe help Ukrainians who've been doing a damn good job of defending themselves if we can kind of keep them supplied with weapons and anything else, and kind of give comfort to their refugees, maybe. But basically we're ending up in a situation one way or another where this is kind of is this a new Cold War? Is this a new kind of, how does this end?
Yes, it's a new Cold War, I believe, until Putin regime is over, right? So then you get into scenarios of, okay, well, under what conditions and terms would the Putin regime potentially end? How long can it last for? I mean, I would say, and I said we held a webinar for clients the day after the invasion, and I said that this is the beginning of the end of Putin's regime. Okay, now that can mean he can go for 4, 5, 6 years, potentially more, but he has lost all pillars of support. Right. I mean, what he's really done is brought back the Brezhnev era, right? So late 1970s, where there's no growth, there's stagnation, there's loss of sort of domestic sort of motivation and strength and vitality, right? And so just loss of domestic purpose, et cetera. And then obviously worsening economic and financial conditions within the country, plus a costly war in Afghanistan that was relatively unpopular. Then the central bank sanctions came in that weekend. The following Monday, we did another webinar, and I said what I still believe today is that this is the beginning of the end of the Putin regime, but I think he's considerably shortened that timeline. Now, I don't think there's any clear threats in the coming months. I expect that he would last, towards the end of this year and beyond, but it'll be solely by repression while prosecuting what we believe is going to turn into, sort of after this first phase of the conflict, then a bloody, costly counterinsurgency phase of the war. So he's now invited in Afghanistan along his border. So you're going to have mounting casualties, impossibility of trying to occupy and govern this country, constant sabotage, terrorist attacks. While doing this, it's become increasingly less popular over time, particularly as people obviously are becoming more impoverished. So I just do not think this, I mean, from a political science point of view, it's just, if you wanted a recipe for how to lose power, this is it, right?
I mean, is there also another interpretation that, like, okay, yeah, he's kind of brought down a new, I don't know, Iron Curtain or whatever you want to say, but like kind of decoupled from the West, to, kind of takes Ukraine as this kind of awful buffer zone that just, but then he turns east. Does he then turn to, China? And I mean, at least from my perspective, it seems like China could be kind of, I don't know, their role in all of this is going to be key kind of going forward to understand what is the kind of effects on everything.
Agreed. No, forward. Absolutely. Russia, they've already tried to turn towards China.
Right.
Absolutely. They will.
What is your reading on China's reaction to all of that? I'm
so China's been interesting. I mean, very clearly, if you look at it from China's point of view, and she actually made a statement. I didn't get to read the whole article, but effectively saying that they needed this invasion of Ukraine like they needed a hole in the head. So politically, they stand by their brother, and all this rhetoric about the great burgeoning partnership between Russia and China, et cetera, et cetera. So politically, it'll likely continue to use the language that they've used since the invasion, and give sort of continued relative support via rhetoric to Russia. But then in actuality, financially, economically, much less so. They'll continue the existing relations in terms of energy, trade, et cetera, energy imports by China. But so far, I mean, they've actually made several moves, which are, I mean, relatively interesting, that where they could have given some support, right? And they actually sort of opted not to. So it's not so simple. They had an opportunity, for example, to give more financing that Russia's asked, and they sort of opted not to entertain that. And then they're also very worried about secondary sanctions. So what seems pretty clear is that major state-owned enterprises in China have been given the directive from above to basically do what they can for the time being to avoid, encountering counter sanctions. And it makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, the trade, particularly since the EU is so aligned with the US, typically it's, you're kind of dragging the EU along with sanctions regime. Now that they're so strong, the combined force of all that trade between the United States and the EU with China, you're talking about roughly, if I recall, about $1.4 trillion. The trade with Russia is less than 10% of that, right? So, I mean, and China, I mean, from their point of view, first and foremost, I mean, we're going back to the death of Mao and Deng Xiaoping. It's about driving stronger economic growth while maintaining
exactly. I
political.
mean, this just doesn't
That's
make. I mean, it just doesn't make commercial sense, right?
right.
Yeah,
And
and it's
for
not like
and their
they.
priorities
It's not
are
like they've had a wonderful relationship over, history. I mean, maybe
no, of course not.
recently they kind of can support each other and have this idea of this Eurasian
Yeah,
partnership, but
it's
historically,
been
there's not a lot of love lost there.
right. I mean, it's been a marriage of convenience in
Yeah.
opposition to the West. They're both incentivized to do that for the time being. That can last for some time, but that's about where it extends. And China will not jeopardize its economic potential for growth, which relies heavily on trade with the West in order to stand up, politically on principle with the Russians.
So in terms of then like the kind of global governance and global coordination and in our world of sovereign debt, we've seen the old structures that kind of worked from the Bretton Woods structures and Paris Club and stuff, which may or may not be familiar to you, but all of these kind of frameworks that we've used kind of post World War II were already in the 21st century kind of being a little bit kind of out of date. And so what our world had done is kind of transferred over to kind of the G20 kind of platform of thinking about things and of using that platform as a useful tool to coordinate global interests, both Russia, China, India, the big economies, by definition, are all in there. But that's what we're afraid of kind of in our world is that might actually start falling apart in terms of coordination because of this, kind of new tension and inability to work together between certainly, let's just say, well, it's the EU, the US on one side and Russia on the other. Like, do you see, I don't know if that's a fair question for you, but do you see the G20 kind of, how does that happen? And then kind of beyond that, do you see like, kind of a forcing onto emerging markets to kind of pick sides, like kind of the old Cold War kind of, we had proxy wars and everyone having to kind of choose, are you, which one are you with? And that has a profound effect on, and we already saw that starting to manifest in some of these votes at the UN, where the African countries, abstained or voted with Russia. Like, do you have a kind of view on all of that? I'm sorry, that's kind of a big open-ended question. But
I mean, I have a view insofar as I think everything, all the standards are going, what we got used to, the status quo of the last 30 years, everything has to evolve. Whether it's G20 or the UN Security Council or any of these other institutions and frameworks that you've mentioned, everything has to evolve. So what that evolves into is very hard to say. But I think, so a couple of things. One is that Putin set out to do, with this invasion, with the clear intention to try to upend this 30-year order, which he and obviously China, China's enjoyed some of the trade aspects, but they haven't enjoyed other aspects. Russia's enjoyed the import of all these commodities, but not other aspects, of course. But he did to upset and change, under his terms, ideally, the existing security and political order. So now we're going to watch that, right? It's not going to end up on his terms or in ways that he likes, most likely. But in some ways it could in certain areas. So I think we have to see, okay, how do these things actually develop, right, over time? I think, if you go back to what we were mentioning earlier, I think this does bring ideology back to an extent. And that was a defining feature of the Cold War. And that's why we couldn't say, for example, the last 20 years, we had a Cold War against Russia, because if you lose the ideological component, if you lose the global component of that battle between, Western market capitalist systems and obviously the sanctity of the individual versus, the communist systems, defined by socialism and a host of other things, right? Those are fundamentally competing identities. I think we're getting back into some of these identity issues, right? And identifying ourselves in the West against a revived enemy, I suppose. But it's not maybe quite as ideological. It would be more about sort of democratic societies versus authoritarian societies, as opposed to the earlier, more capitalist societies versus communist societies. So then you ask about what does that imply for the third world? I don't know if it would be as I suppose, bloody for the third world, as we saw throughout the Cold War. Of course, I don't know if we would see this championing of what we saw during the Cold War, and then in the 90s and in the 2000s, what China and Russia got annoyed about was all this, sanctimonious, well, from their point of view, hypocrisy of the West, pushing all of this, sort of democratic values, et cetera, abroad. I don't think we're going to be seeing that as much. So I don't think there will be as much pressure like on these countries to sort of get in line one way or the other, because it's not as maybe crucial to security going forward as it was, for example, during the Cold War. So I think we will see some of that, but I just don't think it'll be as dramatic as it was sort of back then. And I think also, you have to think back in after World War II, it was understood the United States had to take this leadership role. We failed to take it after World War I. In order for world peace, we live in a globalized world, you have to go out into the world.
No, and obviously it's a totally different point of history, and many of these countries, at least the ones I'm thinking about, on my mind right at the moment in Africa, we're just kind of coming out of colonial eras and liberation eras. So it's obviously a totally different, context. I was just actually just thinking of it as I was watching those UN votes and seeing things and knowing all of the initiatives that are happening, particularly around debt relief, as well as what we're talking about normally on this podcast, which is also kind of greening the global economy and linking, debt relief issues with climate and nature outcomes and kind of meeting the challenges of climate change. Suddenly it feels like everything and that was already a kind of evolving picture, but it feels like this has just made any of that kind of global coordination and vision that much harder to pull off. But maybe it just evolves and it's kind of just comes down to, certain other partners without.
No, well, if you don't have China on board, then and India on board for a lot of these climate initiatives, how far are you going to get, right?
But exactly. But that's hence my question of like, what is China and India? What are they thinking? With this whole Russia thing.
No, but even in the Cold War, there was, when you look at, say, arms control treaties and things like this, there's still global coordination on some of these overarching topics. If we have another pandemic in 5 years, are we just going to not talk to China because we hate them too much, right? So I think there'd still be some of this coordination. I think though, for the next, getting into the impact, assuming we see these sanctions on energy, this energy transition in the West, you already have these problems, of course, with high costs. For the next year to 2 years, it's going to be very difficult for the Western economies. The global economy writ large, but Western economies, how much does that just sort of put a lot of these green initiatives on the back burner, unfortunately? But at the end of the day, we're actually just talking about maintaining incomes, trying to avoid recessions, trying to avoid financial crises. That's going to take priority over some of these, I don't want to call them luxuries, but some of these initiatives which you can do in better economic financial times, and that maybe you have to take a back seat in.
Yeah, the only big problem is that we don't have the, as you say, kind of the luxury of time when it comes to the climate change issues, unfortunately. Anyway, thank you so much, Mark. I don't know if you have any other kind of more upbeat parting words or we can just end it here, but I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and to talk about all of this and to shed more light on it. It's really very valuable to hear your perspective. So thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. Look, to try to finish on a slightly positive note, getting back to some of the identity issues, right? So much of the disunity that we've seen in the Western world, in UK with Brexit and the social issues underpinning that, in the United States, how extraordinarily, horrifically partisan it is. A lot of this does emanate from the fact that the Western world, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, lost an external enemy. The enemy, over time, became increasingly internal. This could serve to help unify the Western world again, get back to our basic values, who we are as a people, what are our fundamental virtues that we're willing to make sacrifices for. So potentially this could have a bit of a positive impact and maybe bring some greater unity within Western societies as we've seen them pretty consistently deteriorate over the last 20 years.
Well, thank you for that, because that actually
Tried to find something.
that is, I mean, and in some ways that's already been on display over the last, what is it now, a month this has been going on?
Yeah, roughly moving into the fourth week here, right?
Fourth week, yeah. And I think we have seen kind of some glimmer of hope of that unity, and certainly, kind of a resurgence and believing in NATO, that's for sure.
Right.
But all right, well, like I said,
Okay.
thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Fantastic. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.